There is a significant debate surrounding the classification of Israel's actions in Gaza, with some asserting that it meets the criteria for genocide. However, the United States holds a distinct perspective on this matter and does not classify Israel's actions as such. The US has its own understanding and interpretation of what constitutes genocide, especially concerning Israel. Interestingly, the US has defined forced labor in China as a form of genocide, highlighting its concerns about human rights abuses in that context. However, when it comes to Israel's actions, the US's definition appears to differ. This inconsistency has raised questions and criticism from various quarters. Furthermore, it is worth noting that when China has voiced its own criticisms or concerns regarding human rights, the US has accused China of being anti-state or attempting to undermine its interests. This highlights the complex dynamics and differing perspectives within international relations, where countries may interpret and respond to situations based on their own strategic, political, and geopolitical considerations. This raises an important question. Why does the US appear to apply a double standard? Some argue that this is because the US grants Israel significant latitude and does not perceive Israel's actions as being in the wrong. This suggests that the US does not value the lives of the Palestinian people equally, and that its approach to human rights varies depending on the location. We will also discuss China's reaction. Watch the video until the end to discover whether China can make the US acknowledge its mistakes. Let's begin. Recently, the global stage has witnessed a stark contrast in how nations, particularly those in the global north, address human rights violations in different regions. China has accused the West of promoting the genocide of the Palestinian people, but it appears that the West does not classify it as genocide. There has been a change in the definition of genocide, while influential nations like the United Kingdom and the United States have been quick to condemn China. A significant contrast emerges when it involves Israel. China's policies in Xinjiang, specifically relating to its treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population, have faced widespread condemnation from the international community. The global north, led by the United Kingdom and the United States, has been vocal in expressing concerns regarding alleged human rights violations. These accusations range from mass arbitrary detentions and forced labor to cultural assimilation efforts. Verbal condemnation has been strong, with statements emphasizing the importance of China respecting human rights and adhering to international sanctions, travel bans, and diplomatic pressure. These nations have utilized various tools to register their disapproval of China's actions in Xinjiang. However, a different narrative emerges when examining Israel's actions in Gaza. Despite multiple accusations of Israel violating international law and committing human rights abuses in its conflict with Palestine, the response from the global north, particularly the United Kingdom and the United States, has been less stringent. While there is no shortage of verbal condemnation for acts such as the disproportionate use of force, civilian casualties, and the expansion of settlements, the disparity lies in the material support provided to Israel. The United States has consistently been an ally of Israel, offering substantial military aid, and the United Kingdom has maintained a diplomatic stance that falls short of holding Israel accountable through significant actions. This discrepancy between vocal condemnation and tangible measures raises questions about the sincerity of the global north's commitment to human rights. The approach taken towards China suggests a willingness to take concrete steps in addressing human rights concerns. However, when it comes to Israel, there appears to be a reluctance to implement substantial measures, indicating a level of leniency or a prioritization of strategic alliances over human rights considerations. Israel's strategic importance in the Middle East, historical ties, and shared geopolitical interests have significantly influenced the approach of the global north. The United States, in particular, has consistently supported Israel as a key ally in the region, both politically and militarily, resulting in substantial military aid that enables Israel to maintain a robust defense infrastructure. The issue of Israel's actions in Gaza has caused a shift in the approach of some global north nations from a previously supportive stance to a more cautious one. The concerns about regional stability, potential for increased conflict, and fear of alienating a key ally have all contributed to the measured responses to the situation. While international law provides a framework for addressing human rights violations and holding nations accountable for their actions, the selective application of these laws raises questions about their effectiveness and the consistency of enforcement. The situation in Xinjiang has highlighted the importance of international law and human rights conventions to the global north, with sanctions and diplomatic measures being framed as responses grounded in a commitment to upholding these principles. However, when it comes to Israel, international law enforcement appears more lenient, particularly with the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, which is deemed illegal under international law but continues without substantial consequences. The lack of decisive action on this issue is a cause for concern and raises questions about the effectiveness of international legal mechanisms and the influence of political considerations on their implementation. The most significant casualties in this geopolitical tug-of-war are the affected populations who continue to suffer the humanitarian toll of the actions of those in power. It is important for all nations to uphold the principles of international law and human rights conventions, particularly in situations where the vulnerable are at risk. In order to effectively confront and overcome the pressing human rights challenges of our times, it is essential for the global community to demonstrate a deep and unwavering commitment to the principles of justice, equality, and accountability. This requires a comprehensive approach that takes into account the complex and multifaceted nature of human rights issues and acknowledges the interconnectedness of social, economic, and political factors that contribute to these challenges. By prioritizing the protection and promotion of human rights for all individuals, regardless of their background or circumstances, we can work towards creating a more just and equitable world for future generations. China has taken a stance against the alleged genocide in Gaza, which stands in contrast to the cautious approach taken by some concerning Israel's actions. The differing narratives surrounding China and Israel highlight the double standards and inconsistencies in the international community's response to human rights violations. The labeling of China's policies in Xinjiang as genocide gained momentum during the Trump administration, with figures like Mike Pompeo championing this narrative. Accusations included mass detentions, forced labor, and cultural assimilation efforts targeting the Uyghur Muslim population. The US State Department officially labeled China's actions as genocide, although critics question the decision-making process and suggest political motivations and geopolitical considerations may have influenced this categorization. In contrast, the US and its allies have been more cautious in their approach to Israel's actions, particularly in the ongoing conflict with Palestine. While concerns about civilian casualties and the proportionality of force are acknowledged, the characterization of Israel's actions as genocide has been notably absent. Israel's use of force has resulted in widespread destruction and civilian casualties in Gaza, justified under the narrative of self-defense. The media plays a significant role in shaping public perceptions of global events. In the case of Xinjiang, Western media has amplified the genocide narrative, often relying on testimonies and reports that may lack independent verification. The urgency to condemn China's actions aligns with broader geopolitical strategies, raising concerns about the media's responsibility to critically examine and verify information. On the other hand, media coverage of Israel's actions tends to be more nuanced, acknowledging the complexities of the conflict. These disparities raise questions about the consistency and impartiality of the approach taken by the US and the international community. The geopolitical considerations, strategic alliances, and historical ties with Israel may influence the response to its actions, while the strained relations and desire to counter China's influence contribute to the different approaches taken towards China. The United States has stated that Israel is not engaged in genocidal activities, which represents a significant departure from the discourse surrounding China's policies in Xinjiang. The revision of the definition of genocide for Israel prompts a re-evaluation of the criteria used to label a situation as genocidal. The use of the term genocide in describing China's actions in Xinjiang has been a topic of debate. Accusations include mass detentions, forced labor, and cultural assimilation efforts against the Uyghur Muslim population. While some argue that the term accurately reflects the severity of the situation, others contend that it may be an overreach, raising questions about the threshold for using such a weighty label. Criticism of Israel's actions in its conflict with Palestine has often been met with accusations of anti-Semitism. This raises concerns about the selective use of labels to suppress dissent and deflect criticism. The differing approaches to labeling and condemning human rights violations in the case of China and Israel contribute to the perception of double standards and inconsistencies in the international community's response. The way the United States deals with human rights and responds to different countries' actions can be influenced by many things. One important factor is geopolitics, because the US has partnerships and alliances with different nations, which can affect its willingness to criticize or take action against certain countries, like Israel. The US and Israel have a long history of being allies, sharing common interests and values. This close relationship can shape how the US responds to what Israel does, and sometimes there might be hesitation to publicly condemn or scrutinize Israel as much as other countries. Another factor is the US's own national interests. When making decisions about foreign policy, the US considers its own strategic and economic interests. These interests can affect which issues are prioritized and how much attention is given to human rights concerns in different parts of the world. It's also important to mention that public opinion and domestic politics in the US can influence its approach to human rights. Lobbying, what the public thinks, and the influence of interest groups can all affect how the US government responds to human rights violations. In the end, the US's perceived double standards when it comes to human rights can be explained by a mix of geopolitics, historical relationships, national interests, domestic politics, and other complex factors. The close relationship between the United States and Israel is multifaceted and spans political, economic, and military domains. This alliance has been forged over many years based on shared values, common goals, and perceived strategic interests. The US considers Israel a stable and democratic partner in the Middle East, which aligns with its broader objectives in the region. The close friendship between the two countries can have an impact on how the US handles criticism of Israel, particularly regarding human rights concerns. The US may exercise caution in publicly criticizing Israel due to the sensitivity of the relationship and a desire to maintain the alliance. This approach is influenced by the belief that addressing concerns privately rather than publicly may be more effective in fostering change. Furthermore, the historical context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict adds complexity to the US-Israel relationship. The conflict is deeply rooted and has endured for decades, with both sides holding significant historical and emotional attachments to the land and their respective narratives. The US, as a mediator and facilitator of peace negotiations, faces the challenge of balancing its support for Israel with the need to address the legitimate grievances and aspirations of the Palestinian people. Critics argue that the US grants Israel too much leeway in its actions and doesn't do enough to hold it accountable for actions that harm the lives of Palestinian people. They contend that the US's close relationship and the perception of unconditional support may embolden Israel to pursue policies and actions that are seen as detrimental to the peace process and human rights. However, it is important to note that the US government's stance on human rights issues is not monolithic, and there are differing opinions within the country's political landscape. Civil society organizations, activists, and some politicians advocate for a more critical approach toward Israel and emphasize the need to address human rights concerns more assertively. In summary, the United States' close alliance with Israel, shaped by shared values, strategic interests, and historical ties, can influence how criticism of Israel is handled. The complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the desire to maintain the alliance can impact the US's responses to human rights concerns. While some argue that the US provides Israel with too much freedom, others within the US advocate for a more robust approach to human rights issues. The United States' efforts to prevent harm or loss of life among the Palestinian people in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have been criticized for being insufficient. The situation in the Middle East is complex, involving historical disputes, territorial issues, and differing perspectives on achieving peace. The US aims to navigate these complexities and maintain stability in the region. However, some critics argue that the US should play a more active role in addressing humanitarian concerns, particularly civilian casualties resulting from the conflict. They believe that increased engagement from the US could help protect the lives of Palestinians. What are your thoughts about this topic? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. If you loved this video, like and subscribe.